Hey, welcome back to Road Trippin' with Rachel. I'm Rachel. Thank you so much for joining me here on this road trip as we are in week 2 of going through Ezra. As we are getting into this chapter, I do encourage you to go to my website, www.roadtrippin.com. That way you can look over more of my in-depth notes that I use on this. I'd be one, like chapter 2, it's kind of like the book of Numbers. There's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of names. It's kind of boring to read through, and this is a record of the people who went back to Israel with that first wave that went back. So if you remember when we were discussing Ezra last time, Ezra and Nehemiah are contemporaries of each other. Ezra was there whenever Nehemiah made his second trip back to Jerusalem. Nehemiah was his first trip. That is the bulk of the book of Nehemiah. You know, we tend to think of names, like people change their names. It is very culturally appropriate within Western civilizations that, you know, women, when we get married, we tend to change our names because we join our husband's family. If we were to go back and we look at the 10 Commandments, you know, we're not supposed to take God's name in vain. When we're talking about not taking a name in vain, we are saying we don't want to do anything that dishonors that name. In that respect, though, let's bring it down to a much more human level. And that is that when God gives you a list of people's names, he is identifying that family. As we are going through here, there is a lot that is wrapped up in the people who are being identified through chapter 2 of Ezra. It was a way, one, to identify the families that were coming back, because these were the exiles who were returning. Genealogy was very important. If you haven't picked up on that from any of the studies that we've done so far, genealogy within the Hebraic culture of this time was extremely important, because that was how that you identified who was within the priestly line. It's how you identified your tribe, how you knew that you weren't marrying your sister or your cousin. So knowing that you were a descendant of Abraham, and then B, what tribe you were from, and then what clan within that tribe you were from, was very important. So for example, the Levites were going to have very specific jobs involving the temple, and they needed to know what their family line was responsible for, what other tribes were coming back. So if you look at it, you see that they're all from either Judah or they're all from the tribe of Benjamin. But another big thing is that it records who were a part of the covenant family. Now, we're talking about the Abrahamic covenant, the one that was made with Abraham, where God tells him you're going to have more descendants than there are stars in the sky. This identified who was genetically considered a part of that covenant. So by giving all these names, you are tracing the family lines back. You are verifying that these people actually are Israelites. It's important because we need to always remember that God doesn't keep people from joining the covenant. But my point with that, though, is that God invites people to join that covenant. And we have examples, like we have Rahab, we have Ruth, we have actually in my church right now, we've been going through 2 Samuel, and we have just made it through, we just finished chapter 18, and in verse 17 it talks about Ittai from Gath, which, who else was from Gath? Goliath of Gath, a Philistine. Within reason that Ittai, who became a good friend of David's, was probably a Philistine, and yet he served with David. He probably married someone who was Hebraic, and raised a family in the whole 9 yards after becoming friends with David. There is most definitely a history of people joining the covenant family. But with that, in here where we're talking genetics and genealogy, this was how they were keeping track of who was a part of what tribe. And they were seeing that this was how these people married these people, and these are their families. And in some cases, depending on what their jobs were, like the high priest was never supposed to marry outside the Hebrew people. So if a high priest married outside of that, like his children were then disqualified. It would have to be like a brother or a cousin, someone else who was also a descendant of Aaron would then have to be the next generation's high priest. Or his children would become the next generation's high priest. It wouldn't be like his children. Like there were rules and regulations with that. Because, and that sounds really harsh to us, especially because we are such a melting pot of people anymore. It sounds very harsh, but what you have to keep in mind here is this was how they were able to extend, I'm going to say extend control over family life. Now, I'm not saying like the government or the religious institution was trying to control what happened in the home. But what this did was I've mentioned it before, that when you have two people who come from opposing worldviews, let's say you have a Christian and a non-Christian, there is going to cause tension there if the person who is a Christian is like, no, like I want to go to church on Sundays, I want to be tithing, I want to be taking my kids to Sunday school and VBS, and I want them to be a part of a small group, and I really want you to come with me. And then you have the person over here saying, I don't want any of that, like that's not how I'm going to like spend my Sundays or my Wednesday, Thursday, Tuesday nights. I want to invest a lot of time in the kids doing sports, and sports take place on Sundays, and this is what I think is very important. You have two people who should be pulling in the same direction. You're now pulling in opposite directions with that. And in a time and place where there were very obviously multiple gods and idols, and this was a source of tension that has always existed within the Middle East, in the ancient Near East during this time, that when you brought that in, somebody is always going to give, because the yoke won't break. So that means someone who is going in opposite direction is eventually going to get pulled either way. And more often than not, the person who has very strong beliefs of wanting to follow God is going to go the way of the person who doesn't. Because it is much easier to pull someone in that direction than it is to pull someone in the opposite. One is a heart condition. One is of, I want to be in relationship with God, and I want to do these things because I love him and I want to honor him. And the other is, I want to be self-serving, very much so. And it is much easier to be self-serving than it is to do things for someone because you love them. And the rationale for what they did, when you look at it from a much more like social viewpoint, is that they wanted people to be believers marrying believers. And so that's why, like, very much like covenant people marrying covenant people, it wasn't an ethnic issue, it was a spiritual issue. And we'll talk more about this later on as we get into Ezra, but the idea here was that you had two people who should in theory be pulling in the same direction. And if you have unity and harmony in the home, and you're teaching your kids, now everyone is responsible for their own decisions that they make regarding God and whether or not they are going to have a relationship with him. But the likelihood of that continuing generation over generation is much greater if that is something that they are continuously exposed to in the home. It is not typical for you to have someone who does not grow up in that environment choose to embrace that environment without a very, very strong outside influence. Most of the time, mom and dad are the greatest influence, and your influence as a parent has a lot of effect on the decisions your children will eventually make. And going back to Ezra, looking at like how people were related, the genealogy, it showed how different people were qualified based on their family lines to serve in different areas, specifically like looking at the Levites. Oop, I accidentally kicked that. specifically the Levites, because there were people who were descendants of Levi. However, they were descendants of Levi because their mothers were descendants of Levi. Their mothers might have married someone who joined the covenant family who wasn't ethnically Hebrew, and who ended up embracing the covenant relationship, but their children were part of the covenant because of mom, not because it was mom and dad, or because of dad. There were also people who, likewise, they were descendants of priests, but they couldn't necessarily prove that. Although the Hebrew people were very good about keeping track of their family tree and genealogy, there was a lot that did get destroyed with Nebuchadnezzar. And so as a part of that, there were people who were like, I have been a part of this world like literally my entire life. My father and my grandfather were a part of this, but we don't know how we fit into this anymore. Now, it could have been that they were, they possibly could have been slaves, they could have been servants, they could have been people who had married into the covenant, or they could have been just like people who were visiting the area, and they just got caught up in everything. But they have been a part of the people, they just don't necessarily know like how they're a part of it, and they couldn't prove that they were a part of it. And I know that gets into like the weeds of a lot of this, but what it really shows is how caring God is, that he records who people are, he remembers who you are, and that he sets things up for people and families to serve generation over generation. And even though the way someone might serve might change, the fact that you can still do it is a beautiful thing. And how things are set up to work in harmony and to work in unity, and that it's just that God remembers who you are is huge. And then we get towards the end, and you see all these numbers being calculated, and you realize that like this is, at least in my mind, like when I was younger, I always thought it was like, oh, these Jewish people came back, and I always thought like, oh, it was just a couple, like there wasn't that many of them, because I knew it wasn't like everyone. But when you count, you realize like it's almost 50,000 people. It's a suburb. A suburb came back. That's insane. And not just like that it's a suburb, but that it is a suburb of people who were all theoretically pulling in the same direction. Like it wasn't just like a wagon train going west, like out to like strike it big, like for gold or something like that, or wanting to go into the Ohio River Valley, or wanting to explore, the Missouri River and find a trade route to the western side of the continent. This was literally like a city, an entire city picked itself up and moved. The city I currently live in has maybe 4,000 people. It's at least 12 times the size of my current town. That's crazy. like to think about, like a nation was taken in, a lot of them were killed off or died off, but then that they were created at the speed that they were able to, like 50,000 people back. Oh my gosh, like that's just mind-boggling to me. And then to realize like this wasn't everybody. Like this wasn't everybody. These were just the people who chose to come back. Like there's another wave that's going to be coming by the time we get to Ezra. There's a whole other wave. And it's like, oh my gosh, like I don't even know how I'm supposed to process that. Anywho, that's Ezra, chapter 2. It's a lot to like think of, like it just makes you realize like how big God really is, the scope of what this actually meant. So I hope to see you guys all next time when we get into chapter 3. All right, have a great day. Bye.